Sometimes it really amazes me that someone can put words like that into either a poem, a psalm, or just as we've heard in that song. For a long time, I've used that song when I've been praying, when I've been wanting to talk to God about how I want to be closer to Him. And I knew which psalm it was based on, the reading that we've had this morning. And yet, what surprised me when I reread that psalm is that the songwriter had taken all the verses that showed the desire for God and left out all of the words that the psalm had put in about how the psalmist was feeling. In fact, the song was one that I would sing when I was feeling good, not feeling downcast. It was one when I wanted to express things when I was feeling on top of the world. And it really struck me that I just do what the songwriter does in my own life. It's so easy when people say to you, "How are you feeling?" And there's an automatic response that comes, partly because of our culture that just says, "Fine, thank you." And even when there are things that are going on that are making your heart break, people often don't really want to know how you're feeling. In fact, they might be even quite dismayed if you stopped and told them the truth. And often our words have become a casual way of starting a conversation, but there's no deep communication. One of the other songs we've sung today is a song that really troubled me for a long time when I first heard it, with that refrain that comes from the words of Job 1 verse 21, "You give and take away, and my heart will choose to say, blessed be the name of the Lord." And there were times in my life when I first sung that song that it stopped me singing, not because I didn't like the tune, but just there were such hard words to actually say. And I thought, do I actually mean that? God, do I actually think that in my own life? It's easy to thank God and bless God when things are going well. But when things get taken away, when things get hard, it's still difficult to do that. And yet, during the last few weeks, we've heard so many times when people have done that. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who were saying, "I know that God can do this, but even if He doesn't, we still trust Him." I think this year we have learned a lot about how privileged a lot of us are and how we can take things for granted. In fact, there's been a lot of discussion about it on the television, in emails, in Facebook, and yet there are times in all of our lives, there are things that we all go through where we say, "Oh no, Lord, not this." And that can be true whether it's for ourselves, or sometimes it's not for ourselves. It's when things happen to the people that we love and we care about. When we hear about things that happen in friends' lives that affect us. And things can change overnight. And there can be a deep sorrow and grief can come crashing in. And this can happen at any point in anyone's life. And yet this year, at the moment, there are so many people in the world who have been experiencing things that are overwhelming. I'm sure that every one of us can think about those people who have experienced grief because they've lost someone close to them. And that's difficult enough at any time, but in the experiences of COVID, it's been even harder, where people haven't even been able to say goodbye to the ones that they love. It could be actually this isolation of being locked in and shut down and being isolated from others, especially those that we love. Or it could be that you're worrying about losing a job or how we're going to make ends meet over the next year. All of these things are going to make a lot of people in our country and all over the world worried about our future. And because of these recent events, lots of things have brought back the heartache of how some people feel and have been treated differently, We've been listening on the television to the Black Lives Matter protest and being challenged by some of the things that they've said. For some people, it's opened old wounds of injustice and sadness. And sometimes it's really just made people feel really down. In our Western mindset, we often don't grow up with words to express how we feel. We can admit to having a stress bucket, and we can find good or bad strategies for dealing with it. And yet other cultures do this perhaps so much better. They have accepted strategies to share and express their feeling. They give time to actually show their sorrow. They know how to lament. And the psalm, or psalms as we've read, is one of those things this morning. It is a lament. And this morning I just wanted to share a couple of reflections from it to you. I'm sure when you've looked at nature, you can see that it can speak to us and touch our emotions. Sometimes when I've been to the sea and I've heard the crashing waves against the cliff, it releases some emotions. Other times it can actually be quite tranquil, and hearing that running water can be quite relaxing. And it's very often at certain times of our lives, especially when we go on holiday, we look for places that just bring us that chance to just touch our inward selves and actually reflect on how we're feeling. So my first thoughts on rereading this psalm was to think of a man standing by a waterfall in the desert. In verse 6 we see him place this in the land of Jordan, in the region where Mount Hermon is based. Well, in Hebrew that means mountain or mountain ranges that are found on the east of Jordan. And some of these mountains are very, very high. They're 10, 12,000 feet high. And they would be covered with perpetual snow. But at times of spring, there could often be a flood of water as the snow starts to melt and comes rushing down. And the water torrents down and sweeps all before it. And this is what he's seeing and he's hearing. He can see the snow up on the top. He can see this water crashing down. He can see the valley being knocked and moved away as the water sweeps everything before it. Nothing can stand before it. He can hear the crash of the water as it hits, and he says, "Your waves and your breakers have swept over me." This is one of those pictures of a waterfall coming down Mount Hermon as we could see it now. This rushing, heaving, restless water gives this man an expression for his feelings. He can actually say this sorrow, this anguish, this grief he's feeling. He can say to himself while he's standing there, "Why are you feeling so downcast? Why does it feel as if my world is crashing in?" If David was the author of the psalm, and there's a good reason he was anointed as king, but there had been so many highlights in his life when God had blessed him. He'd been given the leadership of the people. He'd become close friends with Jonathan, Saul's son, beforehand. He had led the people. He'd had lots of victories that were going on. And yet there were other times where he was chased away from where he was, that he was chased by the Philistines. He was in hiding. First of all, Saul wanted to kill him, and then later on, other people wanted to as well. And if you look at the circumstance of his life, you could say, well, no wonder at times you feel down. You've got this weight of all this authority over you. God's promise that you're going to be king and you're going to be able to see these things through. But the people around you deserting you, letting you down, actually wanting to even kill you. And yet he is standing there, letting those emotions out. And he can say to God, his rock, "Why must I mourn, oppressed by my enemy? Why should I be taunted?" When people are turning round to him and saying, "Where is this God that anointed you? This God you say you believe in?" He actually mourned it because he felt that he was actually not sure that other people were seeing him and his life as a sign of rejecting God. And yet, in truth, isn't it true that all of us can have that crushing sense of grief and loss at times? And perhaps there are circumstances in our life when some things have happened where people can turn around and say, "You call yourself a Christian? Why are you feeling down? You can't find it while you're going through this." Indeed, if it does happen to us, we are in good company. Even Jesus experienced that on the cross. There were people, as they nailed the nails into Jesus' hands, rulers who were with him, who laughed at him and said, "Are you not the Messiah? Let him save himself if he's the Messiah. Isn't he the one that God has chosen?" And there were times later on the cross, he said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" So why are we surprised that when there are times in our lives that we can feel that darkness, that emptiness, that loneliness, times where we experience those dark nights of the soul, and they are often written about. And yet, whilst I think about this being a Psalm of David, it's been given a title for the director of music, a musical item of the Sons of Korah. And this is one of the 11 psalms that's given this title. And although this is a really personal psalm of intense pain and grief, it's been given to a group of Levitical singers who sang in the temple. And this means that this was something that the people of God came together and could hear this psalm being sung. So that when they came to the temple and they felt those times of trouble and sorrow and despondency, they didn't leave it outside. They could actually say, "We come and we hear it and we feel like this at the moment." And yet, if that's all they heard, that someone was down and depressed, it wouldn't really help them. No, there is a solemn appeal all the way through this psalm of saying, no matter how I'm feeling, I am going to trust in God. This is a song that follows through everything, that when my soul is downcast, I will remember you. And there are so many things that we can remember God for. So let's just remind us of some of the things that have been said in this. God is the only one who can quench the thirst within my soul. Verses 1 and 2. God is worthy to be worshipped. He is my salvation. Verse 5. He is my God. Verse 6. And verse 8 reminds me I'm commanded to love him. And that verse 8, he will speak to me in the darkest of nights. And that he is the God of my life. He is my rock. And then from Psalm 43, he's my vindicator and defender, verse 1. He's my strength and my refuge. He sends light and truth towards me, and he leads me, verse 3. And he is my exceeding joy. So we, like those people who heard that song in the temple, might know that even if we were in a valley, whatever we're walking through, the truth of these psalms are what gives us strength to deal with them. In Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 7, God promised his people as they were entering the promised land, a good land. It was a land full of brooks of waters, of fountains and spring, flowing forth in valleys and hills. This was the promise that God was speaking about. Real valleys were good because in this land, the land was so plentiful. It had wheat, barley, vines, fig trees, pomegranates. It was a land of olives and honey. It was a land of plenty. And yet the same is true for us, that often where the valleys are is where growth and fruit happen. Recently, we've been looking at the different ways people have encountered God. Yet we reviewed Abraham and Sarah struggling with infertility and God using it to develop and cultivate their faith, that God would keep their promise to them. We've heard about Moses and how he ran from Egypt, afraid from his life, and yet God moulded him into the leader that freed the people from slavery. So these psalms repeat this refrain: why are you in despair, O my soul? It's an encouragement for us to acknowledge that we may need to put, and we do need to put our trust in God. It may be often that for us that we have to stay in the valley for some time, and that we can find that we're not on our own. God is with us, and he can use that time to bring us closer to himself. And even in the desert, when the water floods, the desert can bloom. Sometime without the waters to break the ground and give life to the seeds that lay dormant in the ground, the flowers and the fruit can't come. And sometimes it's good to remember together that in hard times, these are times when God wants us to trust us, and collectively to remember that he is the God of hope and salvation, and that together we can commit to trust in him, even in those dark times. So this morning, perhaps you know of someone who's finding it difficult. Perhaps you have. I have. I found it difficult not to see my family. I've worried about how they're going to manage, whether they're going to keep their jobs or what they will do if they haven't got their job. There have been lots of things that you can worry about. There are maybe people that you are missing, that you have lost. Perhaps someone very close to you. And I think we can all identify with how sad that can be. It's a valley which we all go through. But just like the people in the Old Testament, let us remember that when we come together, it's not the time to actually keep our worries to ourselves. It's to actually encourage one another in that strength, to trust him together. We can do it on our own at home, but it's so important that as the people of God, we learn to trust in the one who saves us. And we have so much to be thankful for.